all them things they gon' get low. No, I'm not gon' play that string, but I say that shit, that's how we roll.
People of South Africa should experience a level of joy that no one can ever consider. Praise the Lord for our come.
By Ann Clay. Sitting at the cafe today is by Ann Clay. Sitting at the cafe today is
I work for the Al-Shabaab and we issue because they recognize us.
Playboy, here we go. All them things they gon' get low. No, I'm not gon' play that string, but I say that shit, that's how we roll.
People of South Africa should experience a level of joy that no one can ever consider. Praise the Lord for our come.
As we move forward in rebuilding this country, one must express serious disappointment at some individuals who continue to plunder state resources for personal benefit. We have seen these individuals divert national funds intended for important projects for their own benefit. We can no longer allow these people to place their personal interest above that of the country. In 2011, Swaziland, famed guardian of African tradition, was forced to ask neighboring South Africa for a bailout. People were hungry. 63% of the population were living below the poverty line. Yet the king of Swaziland, Mswati III, was and still is one of the richest leaders in Africa. His personal fortune in 2011 was estimated at $100 million, and he was sole trustee of an estimated $10 billion royal fund. While the king, Africa's last absolute monarch, is revered by his people, These gross inequalities are the result of a political system in crisis. For the last 40 years, a state of emergency has been used and political parties have been banned from functioning.
We have been born out of a society that encourages you not to challenge, not to question, keep quiet, don't be problematic. Then you will survive.
By the 1890s, Swazi royalty had granted land and mining concessions to white settlers. The settlers obtained large portions of the country, and in 1903, Swaziland became a British protectorate. Anxious about the growing settler ownership of land, Swazi royalty set up the Lifa Fund. All Swazi working people were asked to contribute a portion of their wages to buy back the land. Most of the little land that was bought was controlled by the king. Britain made few changes to traditional rule, and in 1921, Sobhuza II succeeded as Ingwenyama, or leader of the Swazi people. He was advised by the Queen Mother and the Liqoqo, a council of elders largely composed of members of the royal family. By the 1940s, the British had taken so much land that only 1/3 was left for the Swazi people. Industry grew, and in towns and workplaces, political parties and trade unions developed to represent people's views. Sobhuza saw them as un-Swazi divisive elements brought by imperialists. The trade unions organized worker strikes against low pay.
The conditions of the cane cutters was terrible. The conditions in the mines were terrible in terms of what their remuneration, in terms of the environment, in terms of safety. They were appalling. That was one trigger that brought the unions into uniting with all forces that wanted change from the colonial regime.
Many saw the king's insistence on tradition as stifling. By the early 60s, there was a clear resistance to Sobhuza's authoritarian style, which he claimed was traditional, as well as to British rule.
In the 1960s, you have a wave of liberation movements in Africa. So Swaziland is not going to be left behind. The modern, educated people then come into the picture. They start by forming associations, but then eventually the associations are graduating into political movements.
Dr. Ambrose Zwane, leader of the Ngwane National Liberatory Congress, or NNLC, spoke of the sudden awakening of a dispossessed people, fully determined to rise to nationhood of equality with other. Liberatory Congress, or NNLC, spoke of the sudden awakening of a dispossessed people, fully determined to rise to nationhood of equality with other.
the year of our Lord 1827, a great part of East Africa constituted a formidable empire under the rule of one man. Shaka.
Greetings to all the fighters, commissars, and all the progressive forces in all parts of the world. Today's presentation is going to focus on the history of South Africa, the geopolitical territory. We call South Africa one of the very few countries in the world that has got a geographic name, South of Africa. So we're going to contextualize where we come from as this political territory called South Africa. And a lot of people are going to ask, why are we discussing South Africa? Why are we discussing the history of South Africa? It is important to do so because we are taking a serious and notable lesson from Marcus Garvey, who says that a people without a knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. But also are taking a lesson from Marcus Tullius Cicero, one of the greatest Roman Empire leaders, who said that to be ignorant of what of a child is to remain always a child. So we do not want to be children. We want to understand where we're going so that we can put in clearer context the politics that we are confronted with now. But also we're taking a lesson from Anton Muziwa Kelambede, the first president of the Congress Youth League, who said that one who wants to create the future must not forget the past. It is important that we understand where we come from so that we understand clearly the politics that we're engaged in now and where they come from. But also our ideological tools of analysis, our guide to action, Marxism, is founded on the philosophy of historical materialism, which basically says that we came from different stages of human development, and we must appreciate that the stage that we're in now, which is capitalism, is not the end phase of human societal development. So we're going to deal with the history of South Africa and context so that we're able to do and understand clearly what defines our politics now. And the reason why we have to discuss the history of South Africa is because there are so many colonial and mostly white narratives that tend to define South Africa's history as the history of white people. So a lot of history books, even the history that is taught in schools in our curriculum, focuses on the history of white people. So if you check so many books and textbooks, there are so many which we are going to make reference to here. Some even go to the extent of saying that the history of South Africa started in Portugal, or started in Holland, or started in 1652, when the settler colonialists arrived in South Africa to begin a process of devastating and brutal colonization of a territory we call South Africa today. So we're going to give that context so that all of us understand properly where we come from. And that is the most important thing that we can do for ourselves. And this cannot be an exhaustive discussion because history is too much. There is too much information. There are so many books that have been written. There's so many archaeological books and discoveries that illustrate what was before we were. So we need to understand that in context so that we're able to give a proper context. In the readings that we have prescribed for this particular discussion, we said that we must look into a book by Leonard Thompson on the history of South Africa. It is one of the most important books because it acknowledges and gives a clearer context of the history of Africans in pre-colonial situations, in the pre-colonial context. A lot of history books, a lot of history narratives, a lot of chronologies of where South Africa comes from, almost always starts from 1652, as if Africans never existed in this part we call South Africa today. And an interesting observation that is made in this particular book is that indigenous Southern Africans were not a tabula rasa of white invaders or capitalists to civilize or to victimize. Over many centuries, they had been developing social forms and cultural traditions that colonialism, capitalism, and apartheid have assaulted, abused, and modified, but never eradicated. And that speaks to the